everyone. Today is the last masterclass of Indian Debating League. As you have seen, 13 plus masterclasses with the world's best debater and India's largest tournament with 1,300 students participating and 10,000 of people as spectators. We have with us Harish Natarajan sir, and Harish Natarajan sir is the one who's actually helping us in sort of envisaging this biggest tournament that we sort of think across as company, and not just us, but with our partners, Indian School Debating Society, FAMPay, Open House, Vedantu. So thanks a lot to every one of our partner, and importantly, thanks a lot to Harish sir. Harish sir, can you wave your hand? That will be great. Let me try to unmute, sir. Harisha, you're not audible. Can we hear you? Okay. In the meanwhile, Harisha joins in. And let me put that Harisha is one of the best debater, and not just the best debater. So one, he's a alumni of Oxford as well as Cambridge, a European debating champion, world school debating uh, championship finalist, as well as the only and the first person to beat IBM's AI. And most importantly, he's a credible person helping us out along this Indian debating league with everything that we sort of coming across, all master classes kind of being helped through him. So with that, let me ask Harish sir to give bit of words, and then we do session with the sir on adjudication, and then few questions that sir can answer. Over to you, sir.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Just wonderful. Apologies. Strangely, despite being in central London, my internet's been very choppy today, but I guess that's just the way of the world. So if at any point you can't hear me, just wave or put a thumbs up. Someone comments? Okay, but I think it's working. Okay, great. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about adjudication. And the purpose of this is, over the other masterclasses, you've got an idea of how you are meant to approach debating. But I want to look at it from the other side, how you being evaluated, how should you be evaluated? And one of the values of this is, normally we just try and think, we need to be persuasive. We've been told some rules about how to win debates, and that's all great. But sometimes looking at it from the other perspective, how we are actually being evaluated can be a useful step to improving our appreciation of debating. And in particular, I think once we start, one of the difficulties many students face is we think about how we can make our speeches persuasive, but don't really always think of how we come across to someone else listening to us. So we can have all the best arguments, the best ideas, but are we actually communicating them in an effective way to our audience? In the case of debating in a formal setting, your audience is your judge, the reasonable average individual, the global informed citizen, however you think about it. But in all walks of life, it's not just about what we're saying or what we think we're saying, it is what the other individual receives from what we are saying. And there are many skills on that part of it, and I just want to talk you through some of them, but please feel free to ask questions so you can come up with any questions you have to help sharpen your understanding of debating. But I want to start with if there's one thing to take away from this, it's what exactly you're trying to do in a debate. And on the simplest level, and this is sounding deceptively straightforward, but you're going to try and prove that on balance, your side of the debate is correct. You are trying to prove that to a reasonable average individual. Well, let's disaggregate that and talk about through what all of that means. The first place to start is, what do we mean by on balance? Because one of the misconceptions we often get when we're in a debate is that we have to win every single argument. Every single argument has to fall on our side of the debate. But let's think about this in the real world. If we're going for one of the most simple debates, but one which seems to be really weighted on one side, this house would fund school, this house would make education free. Well, it's definitely the case that that is going to cost money. There's no doubt about it. At least in the short run, it is going to be a negative financial cost to the government. That isn't an argument that if you try and negate from the proposition world, you'll be able to win. But I just want to stop there because I think that highlights that in any debate, you can win arguments, you can lose arguments. The core question is, are the arguments that I prove and I win more important than the arguments I lose? And think through that all the time. Because if you have two equally good teams or roughly equally good teams, if you have a debate which has two clear sides to it, so it isn't incredibly biased as a motion towards either the affirmative side, the proposition side, or the opposition side, there are going to be arguments on both sides which are true. So rather than thinking through, how do I prove each and every single argument falls on my side? It would be great if you could do that, and maybe in a small set of cases you can. But think instead, what arguments can I prove, and why do they matter so much in the context of the debate? So there's one thing to take away from everything I'm going to say as we talk about this in lots more detail. It's that you're trying to prove on balance your side of the debate is correct. Now let's go back away from that and look at the ways in which judging operates, who is meant to be ideally judging you, and what criterion they are using. As we go along, while the focus here is what judges do, I'll make a couple notes about what that means for you as a speaker. So let's start with part one. What exactly is a model judge? Now, when we are being judged, we're rarely actually being judged by a model judge, but this is the idea of what a judge should be doing. And as a result, it should give you an idea of the person or attributes of the person you're trying to convince. You're not just trying to convince your friends, your family, your teachers, people you know, but what we would consider to be the ordinary intelligent voter or the average reasonable person. But what exactly does that mean? Well, first, that voter, that judge is impartial. They don't judge a team you have a strong personal bond to. That should be fairly obvious. You can't really be unbiased if you're judging your best friend, you're judging your parents, you're judging your children. But more importantly, they are going to be unbiased. That means that you do not have a prior idea of who or which side is going to win the debate. You are setting aside your personal opinions about a motion or the value of any specific argument. You don't expect the team to make your preferred argument, nor are you going to ignore arguments that you just don't like. You are not, in other words, judging the debate before it occurs, and you will not have strong preconceptions about this being the winning argument or this being a terrible argument. So you're approaching it as someone who's very open-minded, as someone who is not having preconceptions. So that's the first part of it. It's about trying to start by elimination of bias, not just personal bias, which we're all used to, but also bias in terms of which side do we think is correct and what kind of arguments do we think are the most powerful. The second part of that, which follows almost directly, is you are open-minded. So the notion of bias is that rather being objective, rather than judging a debate based on who is better, it is judging a debate based on personal beliefs, which could be personal in the sense it could be, I like this person more, or bias in terms of, I think this side is correct. All of these give rise to unfairness. So what you should then be doing is you should be open-minded and concerned and think carefully about how you're willing to vote. That means that you're willing to be convinced by debaters who provide the most compelling case. It's not that you're just going to assume, well, you're on the side I agree with, you are therefore correct. I'm going to be open-minded to either side potentially winning the debate. And part of that then requires me being observant and diligent. And this is an important distinction between debating and the way in which we communicate normally, which is if I'm having a conversation with someone, they're probably not going to be listening to everything which I am saying. The ideal judge, though, is they are paying close attention and they're not reading into what you are saying. So I'm just listening to the words you are saying and what you mean from it. I'm putting a lot of effort into it. More often than not, I'm writing the arguments carefully down, what we call tracking arguments, such that if you asked me after the debate, could I summarize your speech? I should be able to do so. Now, that is not the same as saying that a judge will get everything you say down. There is still an onus on the speaker to make it easy for their speech to be followed, easy for a judge to know what all the core arguments are. But a judge is meant to be observant and diligent to the best of their ability. Here's where I would make one important distinction, which should have an impact on the way many of us think about how we go forward with debating. You can have a notion of an ideal judge, a judge who is listening to everything you're saying. But in the real world, there are lots of reasons why a judge won't get everything you're saying. Some of those are human. You won't be able to listen to every sentence. The speaker's talking too fast, in which case you need to be a little bit more careful about how quickly you speak. You won't necessarily get everything down if the speech isn't well structured, i.e. if it doesn't move from one point to the next point to the next point. And it's more likely that if you put effort into being clear and use some stylistic devices like pausing before an important few sentences, changing your tone, it is more likely a judge will get what you are saying. So while the ideal judge is observant and diligent, it is also up to the speaker to reduce the chances that a reasonable individual trying to pay attention to what you're saying still understands what you're saying. But what kind of knowledge then do we expect this judge to have? So I think the normal rule on this is you should have a generally good level of knowledge. You're aware of what's happening in current affairs and basic facts, but you're not a specialist in every subject. So I would expect, for instance, a judge to know that the United States has withdrawn from Afghanistan, that the Taliban is now largely in control, but you wouldn't necessarily know the facts and the different parts of the Taliban and all the details related to it. So that's a general knowledge you're expected to know. And the final part is you should be accountable. You should be able not just to say, I found the proposition team to be more persuasive. You should be able to explain carefully why you have come to the call you have come up with based on what has happened in the debate, and all that comes from outside of the debate would be this general knowledge. And as a speaker, what that means is you could expect the judge to provide you a justification. There are going to be times where you do not agree. There are going to be times where either because you missed what another team said, or you didn't communicate what you wanted to clearly enough, you may believe you won when in reality the judge thinks you have lost. But as long as they're able to provide a justification, looking through the arguments made, they are doing a part of their job. That doesn't mean you can't have better or worse judging. But what it does mean is that as long as the judge is able to have a sound understanding of the issues in the debate, even if you may have missed some of these, which always happens when you're speaking, that is a good first step. So just to summarize some of this, what a judge should not be doing, and if you hear this from a judge, there is probably going to be an issue. The first is judges should not use extreme specific knowledge. That is to say that you can use general knowledge, what everyone would know if they were reading the front pages of major newspapers a couple of times a week. But I wouldn't, for instance, expect them to know lots of details. So let's go for an example. The proposition claimed 1 million electric cars are produced in the UK, and it wasn't attacked by the opposition. But this is my field of expertise, and I know the correct number is 390,000, and therefore the argument falls. Now, that may all be true. I mean, those numbers I just made up, but it would be a bad way of judging, because that's using extreme knowledge and specific knowledge external to the debate, which almost no one would actually have to decide who has won the debate. So that would not be something a judge should do, because that is a judge discounting an argument on very specific knowledge. Second, judges should not assess the content in the debate based on the arguments a team could have made. By which I mean, there may well be plenty of debates where the judge would have wanted to make different arguments, would have thought this argument is more persuasive, particularly the judge has done lots of debating before. But you shouldn't be penalized based on what you did not say, because that is someone taking their outside opinion of what the ideal arguments would be and saying, since you didn't make these, you are not going to do well in the debate. That doesn't mean after an adjudication, if you ask the judge, do you have other arguments I could have made? Absolutely. A judge could say, well, here are some ideas for future debates like this. But the fact there are different arguments that could have been made and the judge would have made is not a metric for deciding who wins. And similar to that, you should not discount an argument as a judge because you could have responded to it. So it shouldn't be like, you made the argument well, fair enough, but I have 3 different ways of responding to your argument. As a result, it is not very persuasive. I know the teams did not make these responses, but nonetheless, given there are so many responses I could think to, your argument isn't very strong. And that then is not a way of looking at judging. So you should not discount an argument based on things which you could have said or responses which could have been provided. And the final part of that is you should not fill in gaps in analysis which are made. So a couple of things which are relevant here. Hold on 1 second.
To everyone, we have sent the mails for Karnataka. The rest we are just sending. Sure, sir. In the meanwhile, everyone can start putting their questions. Can you send it to the email? I will send it privately. Sure. So from the Karnataka, we have sent out the emails. If you have not received, you can share it on Ogly's WhatsApp number. Motion will be given to 24 hours prior. Okay. I guess. Oh, sorry, my bad. Sorry. Yes, it's my bad, Harish.
Yep, sorry about that.
Uh, you're audible. I'm making you a
So,
co-host actually. So
just then to summarize what then has happened here. So the model judge should be respectful, should be listening and should be diligent, should be paying attention, but should not be asserting themselves into the round. That is their personal opinion on the debaters, the personal opinion on the motion, which argument you should or should not make, or the responses. So you are largely a neutral observer. So that is what a model judge is like. Let's then move on to the second part of it. Once we know who is judging, how do we know who wins? So a judge should be determining which team did the best to persuade them that on balance, their side of the debate is correct. You are doing so as the ordinary intelligent voter, someone who is not biased, and then making the decision. And that is broadly what we have said before. But how exactly then do you do that? There are three different areas which I think are worth looking into here. The first is what exactly a team said. Now, different forms of debating have slightly different ways of deciding who wins, but I'm going to start with the world school's way of looking at things. But the highest arching comment here is the purpose of all the teams is to persuade the ordinary intelligent voter that on balance their side of the debate is correct. And there will be three ways in which you are doing so. The first and most obvious is content. What is being presented? That's your arguments, your responses, points of information, all of these which are trying to prove your side of the debate is correct, and explanations as to why each of these arguments and each of your arguments are true. So content is your argument true? And explaining why it is true. So that's the first part of it and the most obvious part of it. And we'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. The second is style, which is how do you present that? And let's just be clear, this isn't about your accent. This isn't about the way you sound. It's about trying to make it as clear as possible to judges. By that, I mean, it's going to include the pace of how quickly you talk. And this should be fairly obvious, which is if you talk really, really fast, an ordinary intelligent person will not get most of what you say. Conversely, if you sometimes talk a little bit faster, sometimes slower, if you're trying to maintain eye contact, if you're trying to change your tone ever so much, i.e. be a little bit louder, a little bit softer, that can make certain parts of your speech stand out. But the final part of style is to think, how do I make each of my arguments matter? Because something could be true, but why should I care so much? And think about the language you use to make things seem like they're very important, to make it seem like there's an emotional connection. And that then is the point of style, which is you have what you say, the content, how well it's explained, but then using style to make sure a judge gets it and can elevate its importance. The final that part of this is what we call strategy, which is why are you saying what you are saying? And that can include, is what you're saying particularly relevant? Is it consistent between speeches? And have you picked the main points of clash in a debate? Which is, there can be lots of issues going through a debate, but which ones matter the most? And that's partly going to be which ones do you spend a lot of time on? When you have partners, which ones do they spend a lot of time on? and why are you claiming your argument matters the most? So putting it step by step, what are you saying? How are you saying it? And why are you focusing on this argument? And those are the ways in which judges are deciding which team ends up being the most powerful. So let's take some bits of this, but I'm going to focus primarily on the evaluation of your content. And people look at this in different ways. But I want to say there's three things which you should be doing. The first is making sure your argument is logical. So you have a clear statement about what your argument is. The point about that statement is it makes it clear for you, for the judge and the other team, what you are trying to prove. You then need rigorous logic. An argument is not just an assertion. It's not just claiming something is true. It involves logical links to explain why something is true. So you have your statement, then you're going to have your logic explaining carefully why something is true. One way of testing this out for yourself is think through what you're saying and ask, is this an obviously true link? If someone would say, why is that true? Would I have an answer to it? Now, there's only so far you can go, but at some point, you should be asking, why? Why is this logical link true? Why is this argument true? And I think as you keep asking that, you'll find your logic becomes stronger and stronger, and you're not basing your argument on premises which are hard to justify and aren't obvious. So your statement, then your logic, which isn't just an assertion, but is asked why each one of these steps is true in a way which would be compelling to an ordinary intelligent individual. Then you have to explain its relevance. Now, if you think about any argument you ever run, any argument you'll write in an essay, its statement, the argument is true, logical reasons, and the argument is important. This goes back to what I said at the start, which is something can be true, but will not win you the debate unless you're able to prove that it is important. And the fact that it is true is a major reason why your side is likely to win the debate. So why does this matter? And why, because I win this argument, do you really think I deserve to win the debate? And again, since you can win some arguments and lose some arguments, it's statement, logical reason why it's true, and evaluating why it matters so much in the debate. The final part is to track what happens to the argument over a debate. And this is often one of the harder things for teams to do, that we make an argument, then the argument's responded to. Well, you don't want to just repeat the argument because it's already got a response. You need to deepen the argument, responding to the responses made, adding new illustrations, new examples, dealing what's been said. So an argument you might make in the first speech, you wanted to continue through the debate because it's an important argument, ideally a well-made argument, but you don't just want to repeat what your partners are saying. You instead need to be adding to the argument to make sure it is growing and it is becoming better given what is said by other teams. So you will have your arguments, you will have the logic, you will prove their importance, and you allow the arguments to deepen as debate goes on. Part of the way all of this is done, I think I just want to make one note on this, is that examples can be useful, but they are not substitutes for logic. if something, if you have an example for something, if it's true in the real world, which is what an example says, what that means is there must be a logical reason why it's true. So you want to say, well, look, here is my argument. Here are the facts I have to support it. Great. But that is useful, but not quite enough. It is explaining why those facts are likely to be true, why that example is likely to be true, and the example then helps illustrate the power of the argument you are making. So that is very broadly what you are doing analytically and what a judge is looking for. Statements, logic, helped by examples, explaining the importance of the argument and the argument evolving. The final thing I just want to say about examples and evidence is one reason
Harish,
why that, yeah,
just sorry to interrupt. Can we ask some questions in between?
yeah, go
So
ahead.
one question, because that's just quite in my head. So especially where the motion primarily talks about implication of current policies in future. So for example, this house believes something or this house would ban something. The implication might be in the future. Correct. So giving examples will be seems difficult. So how to go about those kind of things? Isn't seems everything is like kind of theoretical. How to really prove that the kind of world will be a better place if you go with this motion and would not be if you don't go with that motion? How those over there, like, will it be examples? Will it be like futuristic projections?
Right. It's a combination of both of them. So lots of debates are about changes in policy, which clearly will not be immediate. But take a very simple example of that. So this house would ban smoking. Now, if you want to look at the arguments you make, and if the world is better, well, in a sense, it doesn't seem that it seems really obvious how you would do that, which is here are the problems with smoking and why banning changes it. And the evidence and examples, well, the evidence in this case is here are all the health consequences of smoking. And therefore, if we ban it, we reduce all of those negatives. Now, you don't really need to go to the next step to prove here is an example of a place which has done so. There may be some examples, but let's just assume there aren't any. Because the value here isn't going, this was done in Uzbekistan, and clearly that's the model of how the rest of the world works. It probably isn't. It's instead, here is the harms being caused, here's evidence of that harm, and that is the evidence you're using, that there is a harm here and a big harm here, and potentially we can solve it. Or, and if you think about the opposition, maybe one of the major arguments is a ban will not work. So this is like prohibition. In the United States in the late 1919 and 1920s, alcohol was banned. Well, did that stop people consuming alcohol? Maybe, maybe not, but let's look at the examples as to what happens when you ban things. Do you actually stop consumption, or could things actually get worse? So the examples are being used to illustrate parts of the argument. Don't look for the example to be, we ban smoking, let's look for countries which have banned smoking. Look for it as, here are the harms of smoking, well, let's look for evidence of this. Do bans work? Well, maybe we can look at a smoking ban, but let's look at a ban on alcohol or ban on drugs, and using those pieces of illustrations to make the argument more compelling. The other issue with just trying to go for very straightforward examples all the time is you can easily be cherry picking examples. So if there is going to be this house would give governments the power to, this house would supports the death penalty. And one of your arguments is some people who are innocent will be executed. And you give one example. That is probably fair that you've given one example, but you're probably in that form cherry picking a couple of examples where there's huge abuse of power. You aren't talking about the general, you're talking about the extreme. And that's one of the issues when people use examples. You find a case where it fits, to which the response can be, I can believe in this one example for all kinds of contextual reasons, maybe what you're saying is true. In the vast majority of cases, that isn't true because you're just picking one example to justify the case. And I think that's one of the points about the use of logic as well as examples and evidence. Evidence can show both sides sometimes, and it can be very useful, but it's only useful if I believe the underlying logic to it. Because otherwise you're just doing, here's lots of data, but is this data actually generally applicable? Is it picking up other factors? Is it based on a version of the world which may have been true 30 years ago, but isn't now? And that's why you need the logic to emphasize what you're saying.
Okay. Okay. So just some days back we done a demo debate. Okay. The motion in the team setup is that this house would legitimize Taliban-based Afghan government. Now, obviously, the smoking one seems to be much more prevalent argument across the world around it. Now, let's suppose either as country India, this house, or as United Nation, if we have to say that we will legitimize Taliban based Afghan government. Now it seems very unintuitive to sort of really kind of putting the argument and really sort of favoring them. And there seems to be not very many examples in terms of that, how brutal they are, how sort of supposedly like crushing human rights from last couple of decades. How to go about really sort of putting in motion, I'm not obviously on the side, but really sort of pushing the motion or the argument and kind of supporting them that they kind of are legitimate.
Right. In a sense, you may want to step back for one moment, which is the question you're asking is, in a moral sense, is this a legitimate government or not? So is there some theory about what a government should be? Should we be legitimizing a government by recognizing them? And if they're brutal, should we not? To which one of the few, there's a few ways of approaching this. It is difficult to argue that the Taliban will uphold human rights. Fair enough. The difficulty, though, more is that actually the criterion we use when it comes to recognizing a government? If it is, what do we think about the government, say, for instance, of China? And I think there are multiple different questions you can ask and just almost step beside this, which is, it isn't whether we like that government's policies. There are other factors when it comes to whether or not we legitimize or recognize a government. It is not making a determination as to whether or not we believe that they will treat all individuals equally in the way we would like them to be treated, both because that is an unreasonable way of looking at the world, given the number of governments we would then have serious problems with. And we should instead think about what the practical consequences are when we legitimize them or not. And this could be everything from the should we be willing to provide direct provision of aid? Should we be willing to unfreeze accounts which allow the Afghan government to buy food which they otherwise do not produce domestically? Because if you allow that debate to be, do we like the Taliban government, you're in a very difficult position. But should that actually be the question of the debate, or should instead be, maybe we disapprove of the government, but everything gets worse where we do not legitimize them and we do not recognize them? And by everything, that can be internationally, it is worse because of their actions abroad, or it could just be more people suffer at home.
Okay, I guess that's a fair point to make. That primarily, rather than your liking per se, or what kind of impact, and especially the one that I like about, like, if we goes by this idea of quote unquote legitimizing, then other countries, China or say Saudi Arabia, just to quote unquote, will not fall into that bucket of legitimizing countries. Then we will be limited with very, European or few sort of American countries. Sure. So I know there was some part remaining, but can we ask few students to take, ask their questions? If I have your permission, sir.
Yep, go ahead.
Sure, sure. So let me go with the Abhijat Soni. Please ask questions related to the current session. IDL, I will take it up. Abhijat, you go. Yeah. Okay, if Abhijat is not able to there, then maybe let me go with the Swastik Kapoor.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, I
Yes.
can hear you.
So, sir, first of all, I have two questions. So, first is in the starting of this session, you said while reading newspapers, you need to be careful, and these news can help you while debating. So, sir, how can they help us in debating?
Um, okay, so I think there's a couple of things I would say. The first is having a general understanding of the world is very useful.
I mean, sir,
If it,
sorry to interrupt, sir. I mean, our general, I know our general awareness should be very high. We should know everything. But is it fair to start something else between a debate? So, don't you think the judge will think, oh, yeah, some other topic is going on? Why have you started something else? So, don't you think that judge will think like this? Or is it nice to use these kind of things?
oh, so, but having a very strong awareness of the world doesn't mean you have to use that knowledge when you debate. In that it can sometimes be useful, in other cases it won't be. If you don't think it is core to the debate you are debating in, you just don't use that information. But more generally, as you read a lot about the world, you'll find new arguments that most of the time, actually, if you just read the front pages of newspapers, you'll just get a stream of facts. That's not really useful. You need to be thinking about, why is all of this true? What is this saying about how countries respond to each other? What does this say about policy? And the key here isn't just that you get information about the world, it's that you start thinking in more detail about how the world works. And that is what becomes very powerful. That reading newspapers isn't just about getting information, it's about thinking and expanding your understanding of the world.
Okay. Just to search idea, there are a lot of students who are from fifth, fourth, and sixth are joining. So they may be asking very obvious question to you, but they are very junior. I guess that for a lot of them, it's the first time they are coming to debating. With that, let me go to the Janvi K6. Janvi, yeah, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, so what is the main part? So can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the main part you need to focus while you're against the opponent?
So there are two things you need to focus on. One is just making sure you're still building your own case. But what people struggle a lot more with is debating is as much, well, not quite as much, but other than speaking, it's about listening. Are you actually thinking and listening to what the other side has said? And what you're listening for is, what is their main argument? Why do they think it is true? Why do they think it is important? And as long as you can listen carefully, that's the first step to be able to go, here's what they said, here is why it is wrong. But it is often the hardest part, because if you're just watching a debate, listening is pretty easy. When you're in the debate, it becomes considerably harder. And that's the skill I think over time you develop more, which is, I can listen, I can think about responses, and I can think about the speech I am probably going to have to give myself.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. As a curious person, I have more questions than student, but let's go with the Adit, 8th grade. Adit, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sir. Hi, sir. So, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, sir. Sir, like you told us that the argument should be very appropriable because it is very basic question to ask as an opponent. So, like if we will ask our question, so the judge could so the judge could tell us that it is not a right question. So, can judge do that or not to stop us in between by asking a question to our opponent?
So a judge should not do that. So while the debate is going on, the judge should have a very minimal role. That role will be to make sure your speeches are being timed, to tell once your speech is over, to invite the next speaker to stand, and only the most extreme cases talk more than that. I mean, and that could be that maybe a speaker falls off, is no longer online, but they should not be commenting on the content of your speeches at any point before they deliver the adjudication.
Okay. So before coming to your session part, I have just one question related to the thing that you mentioned, that the judge need to be kind of unbiased, need to be neutral, but as in some debates, correct, for example the debate that we done, as the overall theme we are looking at sustainable development goals. So one motion was around this house would ensure there is a enough nutrient food for every citizenship. The idea was primarily around no hunger, and especially cases of malnourishment in India. Even we have food for everyone. Now on the moral side, it seems that you have to really sort of give the food for everyone. Now, as a judge, do you need to really sort of go with the high moral ground, that that should be there as a part of responsibility of a government? It should be there, or just the other way around, that even if the idea seems plausible, then even some people, some sect of the population goes out of proportion, they're not able to live off well, then rest are properly living, and why should we anyhow deviate the life of rest 80%, even 20% are suffering the worst in the world? How do how will a judge should take a stand on it with the high moral ground, or there is nothing like high moral ground in the debate?
It depends how it is explained. So if you're a speaker and you explain that there is a primary duty of the state to ensure everyone is fed, and here are reasons why that should be the duty of the state, that can be very powerful. However, if the argument just goes, feeding people is good, sure, I believe that. But why does that matter so much? How do I compare that with other potential obligations and values within a society? If you are able to prove that it should be the primary or most important obligation, great. If you're unable to do so, a judge should not be overly interventionist and say, to me, it seems like the most important thing. None of these other things matter so much. So it's in part up to the speakers to give the judge a reason why this moral claim is the most important one. And if you're unable to do so, a judge should happily weigh that up against any other moral claim the other side makes as well.
Okay. It would be great if you can give a good argument on this side to make that this is primary responsibility of a government to ensure highly nutritious food for every citizen. That will be lovely to see how you make arguments, so we can sort of improve our sort of cognitive thinking and kind to be put those.
Well, so step one, what exactly does that mean? And what is the comparison here? Which is, this is not highly nutritious food, or nutritious food is a precondition for the vast majority of people to be able to live productive lives. It may be true on either side, people will have some food, but think about what's going to be lost. It is your ability to grow, actually physically. It is often your ability to function mentally when you are not being fed properly, particularly at early stages of your life. It will often be your ability to work or work properly and therefore have access to any other kinds of goods, including the ability to make money, to provide benefits for your children, to ensure individuals and to ensure that they are well educated. That is what's at stake when we look at highly nutritious food. Why should that then be an overwhelming priority for a government? And there are multiple ways of potentially looking at that. One is to say that before any other thing you can get in society, you need to be physically functioning. If you do not function physically or mentally, it doesn't matter that you have the opportunity maybe to go to a good university. It doesn't matter that you have the opportunity to work free from discrimination. You will not be able to formally avail yourself of any of those if you do not have the preconditions, which is a reasonable standard of nutrition. That would be one reason why it must be a primary obligation, because anything else the state provides is based on these goods. And it would be similar, for instance, with a right to basic standards of education. Without it, none of the other things which we seem to offer within a society would be accessible. So anything else which you would say is what we're trading up against this might be important, but it is only plausible and only accessible once you have the foundations, which is one of them is going to be the provision of highly nutritious food. That would be one potential way of trying to make the argument.
Okay, with that, let me go to the Fatima Zara. Fatima, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, yeah. So I would like to ask, if someone staggers during the speech, according to the judge, how much less likely are they to win?
What exactly, so what do you envision that looking like?
Yeah, I would like to ask how, if someone stutters or staggers during the speech and they have like pauses of between their words, how much less likely are they to win, and how much sort of points can be deducted for that?
So there's different ways of looking at that, right? So naturally, almost anyone speaking for 3 to 5 minutes will have unnatural pauses compared to normal speech. That is just natural. Some people will be stuttering, they will be stammering, but that doesn't necessarily decrease from your persuasiveness. That often is going to happen just by the nature of an individual standing up. None of that really impacts your ability to win a debate. The reason I asked how far do you want to push this is clearly there are going to be cases where that is really disruptive to your speech, where it means you can't get the content of it out. And in those cases, a judge is taking that into account because you are saying less and you are not making your arguments fully. But even in those cases, that's just about, in most of those cases, you can learn your way through it. You can get there and solve most of those problems relatively easily through practice. So some stuttering, some stammering, pauses are not a problem. If it becomes a real problem, that just is, and you'll need to practice more because that is disrupting every other aspect of your speech.
Okay, let's go with the Diksha S. Ashwin.
Yes, sir. Actually, so I was just thinking, I think Swastik had asked the same kind of question, but I actually have, like, I didn't understand it properly. So are we allowed to, when we are in the conversation, for example, the topic is, as like a few days ago, we had a topic of why single gender schools are not good. From there, when we're debating, can we go off to a different different aspect of the topic, like there are different, I'm not getting how to say it, so you can when you're in a conversation, sometimes from one side of the conversation it shifts onto a different actual, like the same topic but a different side of it. Is that okay?
What do you mean by different side of it?
Like, so there are a lot of things in one topic. There, like in for example, there's a subject. There are a lot of other sides. There is a topic in science, but there are other things inside that topic. So when we're talking about single gender schools, can we, like, for example, they're talking about how it does not, it keeps the people, just two genders, they are shy in front of the other genders when they're talking and all that. Can we, for example, like in a conversation, we sometimes derail from one part and then go to another topic? Is that okay?
So this is the way of looking, as in there are, at every point you are trying to prove whether whether you should or should not allow single gender schools. You can shift to different kinds of reasons as to whether or not you should allow single gender schools. So maybe one of them is about the social interactions you're talking about. Fine, but you could then shift to say it's not just about social interactions, it's also about educational standards. Do you end up with people learning better as a result? That would be perfectly reasonable. If you want to shift into, but the problem isn't single gender schools, but it might be paid for schools, that probably isn't going to prove that topic is good or bad. So you can shift to different reasons why something may be good or bad, but you shouldn't be shifting to a related issue which doesn't in of itself prove the motion is correct or incorrect.
Okay. It's the last question we are taking. Then we will ask her to just summarize. He mentioned a lot of good points. Vanya Gupta, ninth.
Thank you, sir. Harish, sir, it's a great opportunity to be speaking to you. And like you debated with IBM's AI, and I would like to know how your experience was. And do you think that AI can really replace or assist humans in these fields?
Okay, I'll try and answer both of them, maybe together, which is one of the issues when we think about what AI is capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing. Project Debater had a corpus of 400 million articles, which is about 10 billion sentences, which it has pretty rapid recall over. Within 15 minutes, it is able to search through them and work out what is relevant. I do not know how many human lifetimes it would take to be able to read all of that material, yet alone be able to remember it. What that points to is there is at least some parts in the world where AI has huge advantages over human beings. Processing of large amounts of information in a way that most humans are unable to do so. That's going to be a huge advantage in what it does. Currently, and this is one of my observations, while it excels in that area, that is only one of several aspects of debating. So part of the other ones, which is how do you persuade an audience? How exactly do you present your arguments in a way which humans find to be emotionally appealing? Some of them are a little bit even more technical, which is like natural language processing, which is how easy is it for a computer or AI to understand 4 minutes of continued human text and be able to work out what is relevant for it. Some of those are challenges where artificial intelligence falls behind. And one of my impressions of it is there are aspects currently where humans are considerably better and aspects where machines have huge advantages. And there is a sweet spot where you are using the huge benefits of humans and the benefits of machines and taking them together. Now, the question of where AI goes in future, I think, is a very complicated one. But maybe just to simplify to this question, AI will do very well in areas where you can spot patterns, which is the idea of being persuasive, for instance, something which you could, if you saw 100,000 persuasive speeches, work out what persuasion to a human being is. If that is the case, at some point we would imagine AI could be able to do that. I suspect in many cases it will be true. It's just our data isn't quite strong enough for it to be able to do that yet. So I think there are lots of aspects, even in the medium term, I'm talking about the next 50 years, where AI will be able to do a lot which humans can do. It's currently a little bit behind, but I do think that means it's going to be a very interesting next 50 years of human progress.
Okay, I guess I've asked this question multiple times, the same question to you. So it was great to know that all have the same question. How's your experience to AI? Now, related to this question, so one is you mentioned about, where there's a pattern, it's AI will obviously far better as compared to us. Do you see, especially with the, Cambridge Analytica happened? I know it's, students are sitting there. I'm just curious. So I'm going with that. And I know that some student will be, as curious as me, that do you see some areas, especially human persuasion, especially one-on-one, where they are able to collect the data? For example, just persuading Harish Natarajan for the next UK election
Mm.
through the ads. Over there, one is a messaging. So if it's just AI, communicating to you and me communicating, obviously I might be better at communicating or persuading, considering, let's suppose I have the good persuasion skills. But now, given the data that the AI, Facebook supplied or some other company supplied, will you see that with that help of data, additional data, now what data you mentioned is primarily the broader data. It's not about the audience. If you include the, audience data on top of this billions of sentences that you make, then will it able to supersede the human persuasion?
Well, so I guess the question is when, right? So the issue with Cambridge Analytica is partially that it knows what arguments are likely to persuade you the most. But there's a distinction here. The Cambridge Analytica ads are created by human beings. Which ads you actually see is what's coming up from the AI algorithms with a large amount of data. In some ways, that makes perfect sense, right? Which is there's a data-driven bit, which is what arguments you persuade you. Okay, great. And now, how do we send the right ads to the right people? Creation of the ads and distribution of it in these cases are distinct. But I guess the larger question is, if you take all of that data together, could you have a machine which is even more powerful and even more persuasive? Maybe, and probably in the not too distant future, that could certainly be very powerful, and we're seeing bits of it already. I don't think we're quite there yet. And I would add, there's an important distinction here, which is the ads you will see on social media are one-sided. It's not a form of debate. It's a form of a presentation of an argument. And actually, if you think about what our news feeds look like, what our Twitter feeds look like, it is just one side of the argument because we tend to be friends and follow people who think often a lot like us. And that's a very different kind of space than if you're trying to convince an audience which is at least genuinely open to being convinced and listening to both sides. And that's going to be a further challenge, which I think we're still a little bit away from. But I say a little bit away. What does that actually mean? And there are people who can talk about the speed of technological progress much better than I can. And there are people who we literally have no idea. Odds are 15 years from now, the world will look very different than it does right now. And in most ways, that wouldn't be predictable, but we probably didn't all predict it. If you go back 30 years, if you go back 40 years, everyone would have thought we would have flying cars by now, which we don't. But they would be blown away by internet communication. And I think it's just sometimes we're not very good at understanding what actually changes, but maybe get some of the base ideas right.
Okay, I guess it's going to be interesting to see actually how it's pan out in the future. And there we also sort of love to have your, debate along with the AI, and we might sort of, see it lively over then. With that, we are already past 5 minutes our spend time. So, sir, it will be great if you just again summarize your major points for our debaters, because from tomorrow the IDL is happening and they're all curious and likely to win. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think the major point is Remember continuously that what you are doing is trying to show to a judge that on balance, your side of the debate is correct. There are going to be arguments you win. There are going to be arguments you lose. You should be thinking, why is my argument so important in this debate? And the way in which you will be trying to prove this is with every argument, why is this argument true? Let's prove it with logic, ideally with some examples if I have them. And importantly, why does this argument matter so much in the debate? And this is what a judge will ideally be looking for.
Okay, that's I guess great to hear from the best before Idea Debating League. If sir, if you have 2 to 3 minutes, I can take few questions because look, this is another way, digital spamming. Isn't that a rhetoric that people who want to put their point across, they spam you a lot? And I'm putting primarily for the students here. Obviously, it happens through the political medium. So with that, let me ask few students. Adhya, you go.
Thank you, sir. I would like to ask a question, sir. You talked about the topic smoking cigarettes should be banned and said that we should go with the wider application of the world. And I would like to give an example that is cutting trees should be banned. But, sir, we all know that we cannot ban cutting trees forever. So, how do we argue if you are supposed to argue for? for?
Well, so I think it's sometimes just maybe back away for one moment, right? As in, there's a big difference between deforestation in Brazil and cutting a tree in your backyard for whatever purpose you need to. So I think that we're just starting with that. But second, it's not immediately clear that you couldn't significantly reduce the number of trees you're going to cut. That sure, there is some value in timber. Could that be done synthetically? And I don't know the answer to this. So I think part of it just involves trying to be realistic about what does this actually mean? This is probably talking about industrial processes. Does that mean certain kinds of goods may not be applicable? Sure, maybe we will not be able to have high quality wood anymore. Are there synthetic materials which work? Could plastic work? But I think you, almost by asking that question, which is, there's an unrealistic part of this, sure, but then think about how you make that sound realistic. And it probably is quite a different world than the world we have right now, but you've identified one of the issues and now back away and say, why is this an issue? Can we solve that?
Okay. Last, Abhijit Soni, you had a question. You can go.
Yes, sir, I had a question. So, like, there are some topics in which there's something like you can't speak in for or against some topics. So, how do we make points for them?
What do you mean by that? As in?
So I mean that there's some topics. So like Aja said, there's the one we can't ban trees cutting. So how if there are some points like that? So how do we make points for them? If we are.
But I think it's just stepping back for one moment. Why don't you think you can make arguments for it? What do you think the difficulties are for you to run this case? Because some of it should be fairly straightforward. Like step one, which is this is about environmental things which are just vital environmentally, right? So it is here are real problems with the world. Here is a partial solution to it. So that's step one. There clearly seems to be some reasons for it. What you're identifying is there are also potential negatives of the policy. But all you need to do is now prove that the positives you've identified are potentially more important than negatives. Yes, some people are going to be unemployed. Let's compare that with the potential impact of climate change, which we can weaken significantly on our side of the house, which creates far more disruption. Yes, there are some goods we otherwise can't sell, but now we have potential alternatives in place. So even if you think it's a bad idea, that doesn't mean you don't have arguments for it. And the step is then just to prove the arguments you have are very powerful, or maybe more important than what the other side says.
Okay. With that, it's the last question. Then we are done for today. And after the session, I will take the questions related to Indian Debating League. Let's Shubh, you ask the question to sir. Shubh Chaturvedi.
Yeah. Sir, as you are the one of the best debaters of the world, can you share some tips for us to be great debaters like you?
So I think a large part of it, right, is just partially doing more of it and being critical of yourself as you go along, which is once you have the idea, the question isn't that if you just keep debating, you'll get better, probably. But it's also asking from one debate to another, what could I have improved on? Even if I win the previous debate, what would I have changed to make myself better the next time I do it? And that's one of the keys. You can be taught by coaches and they can be very useful. You can listen to judges, they can be very useful. But always make sure you're asking yourself, what would I do better if I could redo that debate? And I think that helps us improve so much by just tracking what we're good at, what we're not so good at, and then just using it week after week, month after month to see how we can improve.
Yeah, thank you, sir. And sir, one last thing, that how do you prepare yourself for a debate?
It depends. So if you get the topic beforehand, don't just spend your time, spend a bit of time reading through the facts, reading what you find on Google. But that's only the first part of it, because that gives you facts. Think about how you actually make the arguments from these facts which you have, how you make it logical, and then think how you present it, because the judge probably hasn't read all of what you've read. And the other side probably has a bunch of facts too, and the judge won't know which side is correct. So it is how do you make it logical and how do you present it in a way which sounds as compelling as possible.
Okay, I guess that's a great lot of feedback and a lot of information from sir how to really put the good debates. Uh, Again, with each session we have a lot of questions, but we have already taken sir's precious time on Sunday morning. So thank you, sir. Thanks a lot for coming today, and thanks for sort of putting out these master classes in the Indian Debating Leagues. It's because of you we're able to put it together. So thanks a lot being here, and we looking to you in the finals on 2nd of October and later once you're back in India. So thanks a lot, Harish sir, and thanks everyone for joining us. With that, let me wrap up the session. And only the student who have the question related to Indian Debating League that could stay. Otherwise, we wrapping up the session. Thank you, sir.